right, hello everybody. Hello. Season 1, episode 8, the oldest millennial. Today I'm going to talk about the central axis, and I'm going to start with this picture by Victor. He says, to create more of the quiet receptiveness in the body, widen the back with 2 spirals moving away from the center. Let me log in. To create more of the quiet receptiveness in the body, widen the back with 2 spirals moving away from the center. 2 spirals moving away from the center. He's got them drawn on either side of the spine. As you can see. So what the heck am I doing with images? I mean, Eric Franklin in his book, Dynamic Alignment, has a great intro to imagery and breaking it down and how it works and why we use it. But I think in some sense the whole thing can be said just like a kid, you know? Just imagine like a kid uses imagery. Imagine what how a kid relates. And if you can access that state again, I think you can use imagery. And we can talk about nuance, and we can talk about subtlety, and we can talk about specific tools to make it more powerful or to improve your skill, right? Like, those are things Eric talks a lot about. He's great with that stuff. And I think a lot about. But they're not really necessary, are they? I don't know. You know, I think this thing we call imagery is really just a way of describing this process thing that happens that no one else sees, this thing inside. And I think it's kind of unique to everyone, and everyone's got their own skill and talents and ways to tune into it. So really I tell people just to try it. Just pretend like you're a kid and try it. And then after that, we can go deeper or do other things. Okay. So I'm on the chat. If anybody's logging in, I will be around. Okay. I found myself less and less inclined to talk through the processes I'm in, but I'm back and forth between sharing, letting people see, versus going more deeply into my own experience. In some sense, I think that we sort of travel feeling waves together, you know? And that's why I like this medium, why I think it's powerful and cool. And once it's really going and people are tuning in, it's going to be like really cool to have people in different places doing the same thing and communicating and focusing on their own felt sense. So, spirals. Oh. So as I'm moving my back, I'm imagining the muscles to be the spirals. The ones in the back. And then I'm imagining the bones of the spine to be relaxing, yielding, right? And it's not about what I'm doing, it's about the way I'm using the consciously willed aspects of what's happening. Right? So in some sense, the movement you're seeing is me actually just releasing into what's happening. This is movement they talk about in continuum, where you just sort of let go and something starts happening, right? And this is a lot of dancers, I think, know this. I think that's where I really learned it. Well, actually, that's not true. I was studying a lot of continuum and I started to find it a little bit. Oh. Whew. So how can I take the body in all these directions using the spirals, right? Like, what happens in the left spiral if I'm leaning or if I'm twisting, right? Like, just in my mind's eye, how is it that the spiral moves my body into different shapes? Oh. And I'm just watching, and when I start to lose the image, like right there, I started to lose the image, I'm gonna just slow back down. And I'm gonna let it arise again, and then I'm gonna start moving. And I'm watching the relationship between the image and the movement, and I can drive it, like I can focus on the image and just like relax everything out and like allow the image more to do what it is doing, right? As opposed to I can think of the shape, right? Two very different things. So I'm using these two spiraling columns on either side of my spine, right? And now that I'm going to put my sit bones on the ground, I'm going to feel the feeling of the sit bones and try to connect to that sensation of yielding, or yielding the bone into gravity, where gravity becomes the central plot mover. Still got to ask him about that. And imagine now your hip bones, right? Like where the like ridges of your hips are above your butt, right? Like where you put your hands on your hips, because that's the same bone that you're sitting on. If you're sitting right now, like me, if your sitting bones are on the ground, the hip bone up top is the same bone that you're sitting on. It's one bone, and it's the spiral, and it like runs through, and it forms this sort of like almost like two layers of a bowl, because it twists the bone like shoo. The bone does this, and so it's like a bigger bowl, and then like a smaller bowl with like slightly different dimensions. And that's like where your genitals are, your rectum, right? And then the bigger bowl is more like where your intestines are and your bladder. So I'm connecting now to the feeling of the sit bones and the feeling of yielding. And I see these two spirals beginning at the sit bones and spiraling up. And they're thinner than Victor's spirals. Like I see Victor's spirals, but those aren't the ones that arise in my mind. These are like, ooh, mine also seem a little more rigid than Victor's spirals. But these are like thinner spirals, and they're golden, and like they're still soft, right? I don't want to get Oof. I'm gonna actually let them get a little bigger now, more like Victor's size. Notice how that affects my breathing. And so I'm not feeling this feeling of grounding. I'm not trying to ground, like send my energy down. I tried that for years, and there was a dance teacher in New York who said that. She was like, no, don't push into the ground. Like, no, just be on the ground. Just feel yourself on the ground. That's grounding, right? And I think that's very much like this notion of yielding. So I'm yielding the bones, I'm yielding, which is bringing a deeper relaxation in the muscles of the pelvis, the bowl of the pelvis. And I'm imagining these golden spirals, or almost like air springs, springs of air, springs of golden swirling air. And I'm imagining them carrying me. So right there, I was feeling my shoulders relax, and my rib cage felt like it started lifting more. So it's like I'm subtly trying to hold myself up with my shoulders. And then I'm going to go back before I get too into like trying to adjust all this, which is my habit. My natural feeling will be to go into it and be like, ah, I do it all the time, but I'm just going to go back to the image, and I'm just going to let this be. However it is, because in some sense, that's how it wants to be. Like, if you grant your cells and your muscles and all the parts of your body as much intelligence as you do the process of like witnessing the sort of thought layers, then that makes a lot of sense to do that, right? And a lot of people are like, well, thinking is so advanced, but well, it's not really what the neuroscience is saying these days. It's like, actually, there's a ton of thinking, and you're just like looking at the tip of the iceberg, and like your thinking is happening 100% of the time, and your thinking is deciding for you. Like, there is a thinking body inside me, right? That's the name of Mabel Todd's book, The Thinking Body. There is a thinking body here, and it is choosing and doing what is best for it. Like, even the mind's attempt to like want it to be something else or whatever it is, even the mind is just like watching it, and it's just like to remind ourselves that like it's okay, you know, to remind ourselves that whatever the mind is saying about like wanting to change or wanting to do something is great, right? And that's like got a reason. But the fact that things aren't changing also has a reason, right? And so then we get a sort of a dialogue, or even more than a dialogue, almost like a resonance. And this thing resonates, it almost feels like, and then something starts to like, you know, resonate. And then you realize you were just like looking at layers, like tubes, right? The Kellerman image. And that's what's really cool, right? It's like this plane you never even knew existed, it almost feels like. And that is, and I'm still, honestly, I feel still just like a beginner at this stuff. I feel like I've just begun to access it, and now I'm basically ready to train, like to train my body, because I understand that link. Not just like theoretical, but like I've felt it and experienced it, and I play with it. But I'm like really far from being able to like really see what is possible playing with that. And that's what's so amazing about someone like Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, when you look at her body. And that's why like nothing, there's just, I've never seen a body like that, right? And I would say that's because she has, in some sense, gone through this deepening process of liberating her, you could say her body, but you could also say her mind, like from the like sort of nagging necessity that it tends to feel, right? That the mind wants to like, right? But the body is just like silently being what it is, right? And so really I think it's just about sort of balancing our focus, like we can use the precision. Like precision doesn't have to be nagging, right? And precision doesn't have to be something bad. It's actually super useful. But then we can also use the like sort of gravitas, the breadth of feeling the rest of the body, like the silence of the structure, you know. And even, it's funny because even I point head, right? But if I really feel my head kinesthetically, like there's no thought there. That's a sensation just like everything else, right? So I'm going to take a second to do that. I'm just going to feel the sensations of my head and witness. Well, I'm going to see what happens actually. So it's really cool because it's what I expected actually. We're similar in that if I really focus on my head, there's no thinking, right? And yet in my image of myself, when I flash like an image onto like a screen of like, that's an animated aesthetic representation of Jonathan, right? Like, how does that come out? And the head is highly exaggerated, right? And I think this is probably pretty common, that we think of ourselves as I, and we think of ourselves as like sort of didactic, like linear, observable process, which we call conscious mind, right? Sort of thing that's, we're watching it. And we say that's I, but like, and we locate that somewhere. We go even further than that, right? And that's what's funny. That's the piece that's cultural right now. This I piece, calling that I, right? That's pretty old. But this like that I is here is pretty new. People put it in different places, right? So like, what if it were in my knee? Like, what if everyone my whole life had told me that, hey, Jonathan, you are a thinking creature. And if you want to know how thinking happens, well, it's that thing right there in the middle of your right leg, not your left, just your right. I think I would probably feel very similar as I feel now around my head, but it would be my knee, and I think I would probably have a very different body because of that. Anyways, so it's interesting because I feel my head and I feel sensation. I don't feel more thought. I actually feel far less thought. It's just like focusing on any part of my body. So then, okay, like what are we talking about? What are we looking at? What's going on? Right? And this is where it gets really complicated. If you're, for me at least, if I continuously try to understand in terms of structure, and I keep looking for body and mind and thought and feeling and all these different things, if I keep looking for them, my intellectual sort of frameworks, they can't figure it out. And then I just sort of get stuck. And that's the point almost where like a certain anxiety comes, and it's almost like I really want to figure it out before I just like am okay to just be, right? And that's really the question for me. Like, what is it about just being? What is that feeling of yielding? What is that feeling of like slowing or stopping or consciously like actively willed process of moving, and allowing movement to come from this sort of deeper place where something is moving through us, and then to be affecting the flow of that energy through our thinking processes, right? Our imagistic and like constructive sort of faculties in the mind, right? But then even there, it starts to break it down again. It just keeps breaking down because I start to think about that feeling of yielding that I had the other day, where I was feeling of yielding my bones into gravity, as Bonnie says. And they had this feeling, and I'm doing it now in my left leg, of just like falling, and my leg is actually falling now, but then it's like finding its space, and then it still like sort of feels like the bones are falling a little bit, but not falling. They're not moving, but it feels as though the muscles around them and even like the bones themselves, it feels as though I start to almost feel the blood flow in the bones. It feels as though the muscles around are gaining sensitivity. It feels as though they're like moving, right? Like actively sort of moving, and that's what gives the sensation of the bone falling still. But they're not like moving anywhere per se. So I start to think that, well, you know, maybe something's just happening where I'm tuning into the sensation that's already in my leg, and that like I hadn't done that before. And that seems highly likely. That seems highly likely because most of the time I'm doing this like head thing, and I'm like in this process, and like I'm not necessarily thinking about like where my feet are landing, right? And I stub my toe, and I'm like, why did I stub my toe, right? I'm not paying attention in some sense. But every way I talk about it continues to break down for me. And it continues to be like, well, you're still just talking about like the body and feeling, or thought and thinking. And every single time I run into a problem. So I just sort of like kind of go at it different ways, and I'm just like, right? But then at some point, like I have to change my language, and I'm even looking for that language, but I have to change my language to that of the organism. You know, it's just the organism, and it literally feels like my leg right now is thinking. It literally feels like that because all I'm doing is focusing on maintaining that feeling of yielding, that like release in the muscles where like, okay, the muscles are moving, like the muscles know what they have to do whatever this movement is, as opposed to like when I get hyper into it and I'm thinking about the shape, right? Not the image, going back. If I'm just like, this is the shape I want to do, like this, then like my muscles start to get tighter and I like can't control it. And like if it gets bad, I mean, this is the root of shin splints. Like I can feel it. I had shin splints before. It's like the root of shin splints. It's the way I'm using the muscle, right? And then I can change it. Anyway, so to me that feels like thinking, when just in the way that you can sit down and think out a problem. You can say, okay, I'm at point A, I want to get to point B. How am I going to do that, right? And in the beginning, you don't know, and in the end, you do. And you can like do that, and you've like very clearly created something. Now, whether or not you actually do it in the world is connected to this question, but is also a different question, right? But still, in some sense, we've created something if we do that. It feels the same way with the leg. When I can find that state of just yielding and being with it, that the muscles themselves are moving, and I mean moving in like a deeper sense. Once again, another word, but not like the external moving, but they're moving inside, that they're more awake, that somehow they are more like presently activated, and the tension and the pain seems to sort of go away, and it's just muscles moving, right? And this is one of Eric's big points. He's like, tension is the enemy of movement. Like tension and movement are in opposition to one another. Like it's not tension and relaxation that are opposites, it's tension and movement, that we are stationary or still or stuck, right? When the muscles are tense. So it's in that sense that I mean movement. I don't mean like the body can move and still be tense, right? And so in this other sort of deeper way, let's call it like See, I'm looking for the words. I need words. So, like a muscle, I don't say muscle movement because people won't understand, because they'll be like, oh, I'm moving my muscles, right? I'm always thinking as pedagogically, as an educator, but muscle, it's movement. I mean, maybe movement is the wrong word, but it does feel like movement. And I could call it like tingling, but I don't think that's going to help people. I think movement is somehow key to it. And that's just more like my gut sense than like, I don't have a specific reason to say that. But it's like, it's like an internal movement. I mean, really, I need to look to the science, because if the science already has a word for this, then I need to use that word. But if the science doesn't, maybe I should make up a word. I should definitely make up a phrase and maybe replace it if they come up with a word, or if they don't, just use mine. What is it though? It's like movement. Okay, let me try again. Maybe this leg can tell me. So I'm just going to focus on yielding the bones, whatever that means. It's harder to access in this leg. I start to get a little anxiety because my leg is tipping and it's going to like fall as I like yield the bone more, but then I am feeling the weight down into the suction cup of the socket, and I'm just letting that leg continue to fall. Okay. And I'm going to focus on yielding. Ooh. You know, like, what if the only reason my knee won't go to the ground is because parts of my muscles aren't moving, right? And this is why, this really gets into the root of why I don't believe in stretching per se. I should talk about that on a whole night, but yeah, stretching's like an idea that's new, and asana is not stretching, like, I don't think. I think it's this other thing, movement, this deeper movement. It's not stretching. Stretching is like pulling muscles that are tight, which is tension. It's not movement. It's not the quality. And I think that the movement is actually about releasing into something, and it's easy to keep fighting something. So the question of like, ultimately, why haven't I trained my body when like I want to be dancing, is that some part of me intuitively knew, I think, or actually I ran into the trouble when I was dancing. That's really what happened, is I realized it. I mean, some part of me I think always kind of knew, actually, for a long time. Something about this tension like isn't right or normal. Like something, the levels of tension in my body are not, they're not supposed to be there. I knew that, right? And then I realized like I couldn't just train through it. I didn't know how. It wasn't working when I tried. I mean, maybe I didn't go long enough. I don't know, you know? Like, that's the interesting question about the Navy SEALs. They go through a massive physiological change. I mean, their voices change. I mean, just listen to them. You can tell. They clearly push beyond into something completely different. And they self-select those people to be people who are able to push beyond, right? That's what the training is, or the real weeding out process. And then the training is like doing a bunch of really hard stuff for a long time to build up your muscles and your skills and your ability to withstand, essentially. All sorts of things, right? Those guys just like have to go where they want. You know what I mean? Like, they just go where they want, and they're trained to go where they want. Okay, so let me tap back into this feeling of yielding. My point is that in this other metaphor of movement, away from stretching, we don't have to like wait to stretch the muscles fully, but we could theoretically just move them. Theoretically. I haven't experienced that, but I experience it in like little stages, and I imagine it's possible to just like move the body. And the funny thing is that if that were to happen, like the whole body, you know, that's like your thinking, that's your speaking, that's like where you go. So I think ultimately this is a Reichian argument that, like, okay, well, we developed this tension because we had to essentially learn to channel the chi flow, essentially. That there was chi flow, and, like, you know, Industrial Revolution comes along and people just need to not do what they want. You know what I mean? Like, we can't have people working 4 hours a day and then, like, napping and basket weaving or whatever. Or we can if we can sell the basket, right? But like, society has places to go, and, like, we need to build shit, and we need to mine ore from the earth and create products, and, you know. And so all that gets converted from, like, sort of needs, like, just like basic necessities, like things you can hold, to an idealization. And this is the introduction of, like, money, right, essentially, or wage labor, right? I'm kind of a Marxist in my heart, but, like, not practically speaking. Very much a laissez-faire, free market kind of guy. Mostly laissez-faire. Actually, maybe not laissez-faire, but definitely free market. Okay, so it's so much. I lose my train of thought sometimes. So I'm trying to yield these bones in my body and understand more deeply this feeling of movement, this feeling of, like, changing, that to me feels very synonymous, in a metaphorical sense at least. But I surmise through all my study that, in fact, it is the exact same thing, that it feels very synonymous to this thing that I would call, you know, conscious thought, or, like, didactic thought, or that thing we call thinking. Right? But this thing feels very similar to it. And that's why I said, you know, maybe I'll ask my leg. Maybe my leg can tell me the word I can use for this movement, this inner movement, this integral movement, this composite movement. I don't even know what that means. This movement before the movement. This soft movement, this softness of movement, the deepness of movement, the connectedness of movement, the moving cellular tubular structures, the what is it? What can I call that makes sense? I'm yielding the bones, I'm relaxing the body. Oh, but I can't fully get there. There's tension down near my ankles. Oh. I'm going to yield into the ankles. Oh, into the heel bone. Into the transverse tarsal joint. Ah, good Lord. Right? The yielding becomes like, it almost feels like the sensation gets to be a lot, right? It's like, oh. But I'm going to continue yielding into that, and now I see my legs are beginning to open again. I'm feeling the fifth and fourth, third, second, first metatarsal, the navicular, yielding the head of the talus, up the tibia, feeling back. No, it's going up. The head of the fibula, feeling the whole fibula now. Focus on yielding the fibula. Ooh, that's like connecting me in between the tibia and the fibula, and I'm thinking about yielding the connective tissue there. Oh. It's super intense. If I really go into it, I can pull myself out of it as well. I can like really like stop and look at the camera and I won't really feel it as much. Oh, now I'm feeling it in my hand. Oh, my shoulders. Try to yield in my shoulders. Underlying movement. That's a good word. That's pretty cool. It feels like underlying movement. That there is movement, and we know what movement is, but there is underlying movement that is somehow, it's certainly in some sense connected to my relation, like, or how much I feel it or how much it happens, I don't know. It's connected to my relationship of the mental to my sensatory life, right? So my mental didactic, mental linear, I keep saying those words, it's like didactic, because didactic linear mind, because that can, I don't know. But the conscious mind into the feeling, right? The way I feel my body. And that relationship definitely affects what's happening and how much I feel this underlying movement. And it's cool because as I access this thing, this is really actually, I think, what I was trying to describe the other day when I talk about when I can't feel something, I try to look at it peripherally. I try to feel it peripherally. Like I pull my focus away from it in some sense. But I still direct my intention at it. But my focus elsewhere, right? And then it's like I like think, feel, see it in a different way. And it's like I discover it in a different way. And that's when this thing starts happening that I can feel, this thing I'm right now calling underlying movement. Ooh. No one's on the chat. I'm thirsty. Crap. Oh, there's a huge jug of cider. I thawed another jug of cider. We have these 5-gallon frozen jugs of cider, which exploded. And, oh, my low legs. Oh my gosh. Okay. They feel like they've released a lot since I've been doing this exploration. Cool. Ooh. Okay, I realized that I'm shaking the low legs to make them feel good, but I'm like not really yielding my femurs as I do that. So then what if and then I notice, oh yeah, my attention was mostly just below the knee. Okay, so what if I feel my sit bones, feel like this whole 2-column thing that's happening, like what's going on there? I have 2 columns, like really, like what, wait, what? There's 2 columns here. Like, what are these 2 columns doing? Like, why are there 2 columns? Why isn't there 1 column? Why aren't there 3 columns, right? Like, what are the 2 columns? Like, wow, what is that? Okay, 2 columns. And then there's like 1 column. Like, what is that? Why aren't there 2 columns the whole way up? And like, why aren't there, why are there 2 more columns, like, coming off the sides? Like, what is going on? These are the sorts of questions that I'm kind of letting my body ask, in a physical sense. It's like sitting here feeling it, and if I put words to kind of what I'm feeling, that's kind of what I'm feeling. And I think that sort of inquiry, like, even when I say the questions, they sound silly, right? And it's easy to laugh at them and be like, oh, what's he talking about? And that's like just off the cuff. I think that's what most people would do. But there's actually a very deep inquiry there, because when you really look at questions like that, you can't answer them. And in not answering them, we like discover something. And I think that's really what's happening with tension, is that, I gotta say this again. So, So what I think is that, let's see, what is it? Tension is arising. Oof. Tension is arising because I'm not letting my body ask the questions that it really wants to ask. And those questions are not safe for me. I think this is modern man, actually. That the questions of the body, the feeling, the underlying movement of the body is like that back brain stuff. It's coming up into the back primary core of the nervous system, and then it's coming to the front brain, which is this more like rational linear thinking thing we call, right? And it's newer, and it's much more social, and it's like adjusted in these ways. And right, I think some part of me like has learned that certain questions are threatening, right? For like unspoken reasons, actually. I don't think anyone has words for why. Like, I think if I were to say why, I would have to make it up, which is really interesting because it feels like no one has looked at the question. It's like, it feels like this unasked question in the culture, which is really, really interesting. Like, what? So yeah, that's what I think. And I think that this is essentially that most people talk about this in terms of trauma, but most people don't look at it in terms of like entire cultural movements, or like look at a bigger system of how it works to understand like how can we use this human thing better. But in terms of like trauma language, they would talk, or like psychological language, but ultimately I would say it's trauma language at this point. It's kind of like subsumed some stuff. like trauma theory is like subsumed a lot of things, I think, in the psychological world. I think they were looking for sort of adequate mechanisms to explain the mind, and no one really had them, and this is like what the psychoanalysis was trying to do. But then by the time we got to like the Vietnam War, that's when we got this post-traumatic stress disorder thing, right? It's always been around. They call it shell shock, they call it whatever. It's been like different things. But when we put a word to it, there's like an underlying theory, essentially, of what trauma is, which is such a good theory, I would argue. Not even a good theory, but such a timely theory, such a relevant theory, that it has essentially subsumed those structures that we called psychology. And now I think we sort of look at them more as tools in how can we use them to deal with the like root of trauma, right? But even trauma is like, I think, just a step into a much fuller description of how consciousness is actually working. That's way better than like body mind, like you're thinking and you're feeling. Like, no, like it doesn't work anymore, that paradigm. So I think it's time to even get bigger. That's why I don't like the word trauma, but like it's useful and people get it and you can talk about it. So dissociation, right? That's a psychological term, but I think it just falls under this theory of trauma now. That dissociation is a specific state that occurs within trauma theory, that we have pulled essentially our mind away from our physical somehow, our feeling sense. We pulled the thinking from the feeling, right? And this is, if you watch my trauma manifesto, that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's like, that's the point. That's what it does. That's where thinking and feeling, that's where the split arises, is with trauma, which I think is actually cultural and is invisible because of that, and like no one really knows where it came from, precisely because of what it is and whatever. We're in this weird place. We're trying to just like develop useful metaphors. So dissociation mean that place where we like pull away. And I forgot why I brought up dissociation, but I'm feeling my legs. I'm feeling my legs, you know, and I'm trying to kind of even out my processes. So I've got that active mental chatter thing, and I'm trying to even it out. And a lot of my friends don't understand me because of this. Because I will do things and like I see it, they don't get it. And I used to think about things in this like hyper sort of inner mind voice way. And so a lot of times I understand kind of how I might have acted in a different way. But now it's like I'll just do things because my body feels like it, which is interesting, right? And that's much more towards this like thinking body, right? So this is back where I was going with it all, is that I think that the link between this thing we call the brain, which seems to be, I mean, if you listen to someone like Alexander, he talks about inhibition. I mean, he's talking about this exact same thing back before the night, like pre-20th century. Mostly in the 20th, though. I think maybe he was born in, whatever, he was born in the 1800s. So he was talking about it back then, and I do tend to think it does function by stopping us, not by making us go. That like to do something, to execute, there has to be underlying flow. They're like, I put an ice cream cone in front of you and you want the ice cream cone, and like in some sense. But, well, no, I don't even think that, because you can force someone to do something and they just don't want to do it. But then they do, because you force them, right? There's a part of their body that has learned they really do want to go do that, and they've decided that. And some people will never decide that, and they just die right before they're going to be forced to do something. And that is like a thought process, right? There's no right or wrong about that. That's just organisms deciding what to do. And so I do think in some sense there is a flow, and then the thinking is the thing that like sort of is the actual more like the inhibitory effect, like the inhibition, to stop us from doing something and therefore to guide it, right? Like, so a river is like, they dam a river and they put it that way and this way and this way, and it sort of like loses its flow and its elegance, but it also is like useful for things, right? And they can control it, and they can power dams and all this stuff, right? So it's not to say like flow or inhibition would be better or worse, but that our consciousness and our organism is a product of decision making that is balancing those two things. And even that's a paradigm that I'm sure will fall quickly, actually, because I don't even feel like that's a great one, but it's like useful for now. So I think a lot of the reasons that I don't feel my body, that I do feel the deeper tension, are actually relationally and culturally built and imposed. That we have been educated, in the truest sense of the word, educated to do certain things and not to let our bodies do other things, and not to have certain questions, right? There's a lot of questions everyone knows, no one talks about, but everyone knows you're not allowed to ask, right? And like, how did we learn that? Like, I don't know. That's like almost less interesting than it is, how do we change that? And how do we get to a place where we can allow the body itself? It's though these questions are all correlated to different body parts, it almost feels like, or perhaps even the body as a whole. And that by allowing for this quote unquote underlying movement, for decreasing the inhibition or the inhibitory effect of thinking, that we can like not only free up our body, but actually free up our mind. And that's the funny thing, right? That we can actually, because even the thinking process, I think, is flow, right? Versus inhibition. So like now I'm kind of swapping it around, and it's like changing, like, okay, well, wait, what is inhibition then? But it's more to say that I think the consciously willed aspects of things we do is really what we stop ourselves from doing, right? That's what I'm saying. And thinking itself, I think of as a flow, not as something that we do, because that's really just stopping ourselves from doing something. It's saying like, there's 100 million options that we could think about, and we've been educated to believe that the one option, which is like chemistry, is like the thing we have to do. So I actually think that instead of actually focusing on chemistry, actually what we do is we block out everything else. And the interesting thing is that when we do that, I think we are, the culture is essentially training us, except for the people who like loved every bit of school. Like there are people out there like that, but there's a lot of them not. There's a lot of them who just do it because that's what you need to do to get a job and to like live a life that you want in the world. And that's a perfectly acceptable reason to go to school. But I just want to talk about like what I think it is and what it's doing. And I think it's training you not to see the things that actually likely are most important to you because they're the ones that would be defined by you. It's putting you into a system, right? And it's easy to talk about things like the system and down with the man and the blah, 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 blah. And like we can all get that. But I'm really much more talking about like effects of things I can feel. And then I'm theorizing and being like, well, that actually makes sense because like the culture needs people to do the things that it needs to do because it's created roles and it needs people to fill those roles. But we're at this very different sort of fluid time where the old roles are just falling apart left and right. And everyone's like, wait, there's no roles. Wait, there's no retirement. Wait, there's no currency. Wait, there's no nation states, you know, like, right? Like, okay, so now what? Well, like, how do we live a good and just life without laws, right? It's certainly possible. People have done it, right? But are we ready to do it? Like, probably not, right? Like, we get a bunch of crazy like education and inhibition effects that make us do weird ass stuff. And this is ultimately a Reichian argument that like we have suppressed that which is natural and sort of good within ourselves. And that Freud's biggest mistake, right? The birth of psychoanalysis, that Freud's biggest mistake was thinking that the inhibited human, the human who was petty and small and mean and murderous, was the natural human. And Reich was like, no, man, you got it all wrong. You're just looking at like a blinder because that's what the culture now is. And actually there's like a more natural human, which is this non-inhibited human. And it's not the human, it's not like you just took all the inhibitions off and this person went crazy, but like that they still have the inner sense of like a kind, loving 3-year-old who just like maybe wants to share, you know? Yeah, so that's what I'm feeling in my legs. I was sitting on my sit bones. I was thinking about the golden spiral column image. I'm supposed to be talking about the central column. Really, I'm just theorizing about consciousness. Okay. Okay. Getting a nice stretch. I mean, stretching's great if it feels good. That's what I think. But when it doesn't feel good, I'm like, I think there's something different. What if we move into the positions of the asana and just continuously allow for underlying movement, right? I think in that case there won't be tension, there won't be tautness, and that's what I see in the really great yoga practitioners. Like if you watch those old videos of Krishnamacharya, I mean, that man, like his muscles was soft. He was like a cat. And that's what I imagine Victor's like. I mean, I haven't seen Victor, but they always talk about softening things. Okay. So I'm feeling that L4, L5. I'm imagining the central golden columns on either side of the bone. Oh. I want to get back and access this less inhibitory state with this image. How can I do that? I guess I started by yielding in the bones, or yielding the bones into gravity in Bonnie's turn of phrase. Which is much harder to do in the spine than it was in the legs. Oh, but there we go. It all sort of just happens, like almost right at once. I access that sort of peripheral awareness. That soft, gentle, right? It's the same as like looking at someone with soft eyes versus like piercing, penetrating, focused eyes, right? Versus like you soften the focus and you take them in versus like you sort of pierce them. It's like that. I went for the shoulders falling. And my first thought was, wait, I'm falling, like I'm letting myself curl. But no, actually, the ribs and spine, let's see. I feel I lose the inhibitory effects, right? Like kind of grip right behind my heart. And this gets into a really powerful area for me. So I'm just going to yield right behind my heart from like T6 up to like T7, T6, T6, maybe. T6 to like T1. I'm going to yield. I'm going to tune into my heart because this sound feels intense. It's like hard to focus. It's like I'm looking at it and then it's like I look at it and then I use the peripheral look and then it just like starts like blasting light. It's the same that happened with my feet, but it's sensation. And I'm just going to remind myself that I'm not going to burst into a million pieces and that like I might, but chances are very low, actually. That's actually what I'm reminding myself of. I'm dead serious. There's a part of me that wants to stop feeling it and wants to take the awareness elsewhere, but I'm going to stay with it. I'm kind of holding it in the back right now. I'm going to stay with it and remind myself to an extent, like, I don't have to actually, like, push it to the point where it would be overwhelming, but I can just kind of hold it, and then I can look again, and I can be like, okay, I'm not going to blow into 1,000 pieces. And then I noticed my ankles and how I was actually holding weight off of my ankles. It's keeping my weight a little forward. Because it's a lot of sensation now through my ankles as I'm sitting right on them. It's like borderline hurting, but as I just keep looking at it, I keep looking for the underlying movement. Even that, it's not it. It's not what I do. I have to yield to the bones and then observe the underlying movement coming up peripherally. This is all my language, right? But that's how I'm explaining to you what I'm doing and reminding myself of the process I need to go through to do it. Because I'll get to the next place and I'll be like, oh, I just want to like do it. And all of a sudden I've lost the inhibitory quality, or I've lost the non-inhibitory quality of my attention. So I'm just going to trust that like my bones aren't going to break, you know, and like I'm not going to hurt myself. Because like I've sat like this for a long time before and I know I'm not going to hurt myself, and I've seen like old men do this in like monasteries and like they just like sit there, right? And you could say, well, they practice it all the time, and I could say, yeah, well, like, so what? Like my body isn't going to break. Like no one ever like sat on their legs and like got their legs amputated, you know what I mean? Like they might go to sleep and they might hurt, but like nothing's gonna happen, you know what I mean? And that's interesting because like I'm not like even a heavy guy. I'm just like I'm thin and I'm just like sitting here, but I have to actually remind myself, because if I don't, my body would have just pulled itself off already, right? So this is how I can begin to use that sort of conscious like think process to relate to this like kinesthetic think process. That's really how I should do it probably. It's like unconscious, not that word, but you know, that the relationship between them, how they can begin to relate. Because they can be like, you know what, you're not gonna actually hurt yourself. It's going to be fine. It's like, oh yeah, okay. And when I realize I'm not going to hurt myself, pain takes on a different quality. I have a different relationship with it. It becomes sensation that's intense, but not bad, per se, right? If I get overwhelmed by the pain, I don't think that's good, right? Like, I'm in a range where I'm not overwhelmed, right? If I'm overwhelmed by the pain, that's when I hurt myself, every time. So if I get overwhelmed by the pain, but then I have to keep asking, like balancing, right? Balancing. Because the overwhelm would have me move somewhere, but the intellectual process of it is like, no, you're fine. Like I'm checking in, like I'm keeping track, you know? You're fine. Whew. And then I'm going to take it back up to the thoracic section. Feel those bones yielding. I'm going to imagine those golden columns feeling this like uninhibiting, right? This like arising of this underlying movement now up into my shoulders and neck a little bit. But as I talk, I'm sacrificing feeling it and like losing the thread. So go back in. And I start to get overwhelmed now at the feeling of tension around my shoulder girdle, the feeling that my shoulders are not where they should be. And I just be with that. See if I can yield the shoulders, the ribs, the arms, the wrists and hands. And it starts to get stuck, and I feel my anxiety start to rise. I feel my breath start to get stuck. Feel that old T1, T2 right side thing. And I just say, okay, I'm not going to blow into 1,000 pieces. Can I just feel my shoulders? Can I just yield the bones of my shoulders amidst the tension that I now feel almost as an active holding? And it feels like I'm consciously doing it. I don't think I've changed anything, but that I'm becoming more aware, more consciously forefront, acutely aware of the tension that's already there. And I'm going to continue focusing on yielding instead of trying to move them, because my initial reaction is, we'll just move them. But no, I'm going to yield because I haven't done anything, right? It's my mind being like, wait, you haven't changed anything. Maybe your muscles are slightly gripping, or like slowly over a period of time, like gripping, or maybe you're just like feeling what's already gripping. And I tend to think the latter. So I'm just going to focus on yielding. I start to feel like the bones up here, the joints up here are imbalanced, and I start to freak out about that, right? No, Jonathan, your bones are not imbalanced, your bones are fine, you're not going to break into 1,000,000 pieces. Yielding. I begin to lose focus. And then I keep looking at the collarbone, but it starts feeling like I'm being pulled down. Feels like my breath is sticking. Jonathan, you're not going to break into 1,000 pieces. Yielding. And something just released, and I felt like I started to feel the pulled connection in my collarbones to my sternum, rib cage. But then even as I speak and touch it, like I'm increasing that tension again. So I'm just yielding. Just focus on that. Like what is it? And I'm going to even let go of yielding, but I'm just going to start saying, what is it? Just looking at those connections between the collarbone and the sternum. Drawing in the relationship to that heart area, the spine. Starting to see the shoulder blades, the angle, they're at an angle like this, floating. So I'm seeing the angle of the collarbones, the angle of the shoulder blades that forms this sort of V. It's basically resting on your rib cage. So I'm starting to actually like feel that and see it in my mind. And then even as I talk about it, I feel like tension start to build up in here, up in here. So I'm just saying, okay, like what is it yielding, going back to the focusing. start noticing all the little confusions in my body. They're like keeping weight up and off certain things, protecting certain things, little movements, little things. And as I just continue to focus, they start to like do things. And it's nothing I can plan or expect, right? That's what's interesting. It's like I don't think I can actually choose my posture, even if I try. Even at this, working in this way, at this level, I think even less so than I can choose it. It's going to become what it's going to become. Like it's going to become what it is, but I can't plan it because I don't even know what's happening. And I feel my breath start to shorten. Okay, Jonathan, dial the talking back. It's hard now. I'm hitting a sticky point. It's like hard to keep focusing on the shoulder blades and like the rib cage, and it's like, okay, where does my focus want to go? Now I'm really finding the spine. That's funny. I didn't even notice that. That's where it was going. And now I'm trying to yield up into my neck and cervical spine. Yielding in the hyoid skull, face. The sphenoid. The bones of the skull. I'm finding this muscle right in here. I don't know what that is. Oh, in my arm. Oof, that was an intense exploration. I think there's not time for much else. Yeah, that was my exploration of the central column. Perhaps You know, maybe I'll look back on this video in 30 years from now and be like, oh, I was so clearly tuning into the sensations in my central column, like, through this process, and, like, it's essentially where the ideas came from. I think it makes sense. You know, it's like tuning into my leg. It's like, hey, leg, what should I name this thing? What should I call this thing? Underlying movement. It's really cool. It's like central column / underlying movement, you know, like, or like parentheses, or colon, or semicolon, / space, space / space, ellipses. I don't know. Ampersand. OR. Parenthetically OR. I like that. Parenthetically OR colon. I like that best. I don't know. That'll arise. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay. Good night, everybody.